Behind the gilded gates of Buckingham Palace, where centuries of tradition meet modern scandal, a family feud was about to explode into public view. The same bloodline that had weathered world wars, abdications, and public divorces now faced its most personal crisis yet. When a father must choose between the crown he inherited and the son he raised, when brothers become strangers across an ocean, and when the weight of duty crushes the bonds of blood, this is the story of how a royal rift became a chasm that threatened to swallow a monarchy whole. What happens when the most watched family in the world can no longer bear to be in the same room? When protocol fails and emotions explode? When the future of an ancient institution hangs on whether a father can forgive his son? This is the untold story of the week that changed everything. When King Charles packed his bags, left London behind, and made a decision that would echo through the halls of history. The morning fog hung thick over London as King Charles III stood at the tall windows of his private study in Buckingham Palace. His weathered hands, marked by decades of public service, gripped a letter that had arrived just hours earlier. The royal seal was broken, the contents read and reread until the words burned into his memory like a brand. Outside, the city was waking up, unaware that their monarch was facing the most difficult decision of his reign. The letter, written in familiar handwriting he had known since childhood, contained words that cut deeper than any political scandal or media criticism ever could. It was from Harry, his younger son, the boy he had once carried on his shoulders through the gardens of Highgrove House. Charles set the letter down on the mahogany desk that had belonged to his mother, Queen Elizabeth II. Even now, months after her passing, he could almost feel her presence in the room, her steady voice echoing the lessons she had taught him about duty, sacrifice, and the heavy burden of the crown. But those lessons had never prepared him for this moment, when duty and fatherhood collided with such devastating force. The door opened quietly, and his private secretary, Sir Edward Pemberton, entered with the morning briefings. Edward had served the royal family for over 20 years, and his usually composed expression showed the strain of recent weeks. The palace staff had been walking on eggshells, sensing the tension that seemed to seep through the very walls of the ancient building. "Your Majesty," Edward began carefully, "the Prime Minister's office has called regarding your scheduled engagements for the week. They're asking about the possibility of rearranging your calendar." Charles turned from the window, his blue eyes reflecting a weariness that went beyond physical exhaustion. The weight of the crown, both literal and metaphorical, seemed heavier than ever. "Cancel everything for the next week, Edward. I need time to think." Edward's eyebrows rose slightly, the only sign of his surprise. In all his years of service, he had rarely seen the king request such a dramatic change to his schedule. "Shall I prepare an official statement, Your Majesty?"
"Not yet," Charles replied, moving to his desk and picking up the letter once more.
"But prepare Sandringham House. I'll be leaving London this afternoon." The decision seemed to surprise even Charles himself. Sandringham had always been his refuge, the Norfolk estate where he felt most at peace, away from the constant scrutiny of London and the weight of official duties. It was where he gardened, painted, and found solace in the simple rhythms of rural life. But it was also where some of his happiest memories with his sons had been made, back when Harry and William were young boys who saw him simply as their father, not as the future king. As Edward left to make the arrangements, Charles found himself thinking back to the events that had led to this moment. The rift with Harry had been building for years, like a crack in a dam that slowly widened until it threatened to destroy everything in its path. What had started as disagreements over Harry's role in the royal family had escalated into something much more personal and painful. The trouble had begun in earnest after Harry's marriage to Meghan Markle. Charles had welcomed his new daughter-in-law warmly, hoping that love might bring his youngest son the happiness that had often seemed to elude him. But the pressures of royal life, the relentless media tension, and the complex web of protocol and tradition had proven too much. The couple's decision to step back from royal duties had been a blow, that Charles had tried to understand their desire for a different life. What followed, however, had been far more devastating than he could have imagined. The interviews, the accusations, the very public airing of private family grievances had left deep wounds that seemed impossible to heal. Each revelation felt like another nail in the coffin of their relationship, another barrier between father and son. The most recent clash had occurred during what was supposed to be a private family gathering. Harry had returned to London for what the palace had carefully described as personal meetings. The brothers had met first, William and Harry sitting in the same room for the first time in months, their conversations stilted and formal, like diplomats from warring nations. Charles had hoped that his presence might help bridge the gap between his sons. He remembered them as boys, how they had supported each other through their mother's death, how they had seemed unbreakable in their bond. But the years had changed them both, carved them into different men with different values and different visions for their futures. The meeting had started civilly enough. They had discussed charitable work, shared memories of their grandmother, even managed a few moments of what felt like genuine warmth. But as the evening wore on, old grievances surfaced like thorns in a garden that had seemed carefully tended. Harry had spoken about his new life in California, about his work with various foundations, about his determination to protect his family from what he saw as the toxic environment of royal life. His words were passionate, sincere, but they carried an implicit criticism of the institution that Charles had devoted his entire life to serving. William, ever the dutiful heir, had grown increasingly tense as the conversation continued. He had made his own sacrifices for the crown, had accepted the weight of future kingship with a grace that reminded Charles painfully of his late mother. To hear his brother essentially reject everything they had been raised to value was clearly difficult for him. The breaking point had come when Harry had made a comment about the family's inability to protect the people they claimed to love. The reference to Diana was unmistakable, the wound still raw after all these years. William's face had darkened, and Charles had felt something break inside his chest as he watched his son's relationship fracture a little more. "You don't understand the pressure we're under," William had said, his voice tight with controlled emotion. "You walked away from all of this, but some of us don't have that luxury." "And you think I don't have pressure?" Harry had shot back. "You think it's easy to be painted as the villain in my own family's story." Charles had tried to intervene, to find some middle ground that might bring his sons together, but his words had seemed to fall on deaf ears. The conversation had devolved into accusations and counter-accusations, each brother defending choices that the other couldn't understand. The final blow had come when Harry had directly challenged his father's leadership, questioning decisions that had been made about the family's public engagements and private security arrangements. It wasn't just disagreement, it was a fundamental rejection of Charles's authority as both king and father. "You always choose the institution over your family," Harry had said, his voice breaking slightly. "Even now, even after everything that's happened, you still can't see past the crown." The words had hit Charles like a physical blow. He had spent his entire life trying to balance his roles as father and future monarch, making choices that often satisfied no one completely. To be accused of failing his son in such a fundamental way was almost more than he could bear. William had left first, his goodbye formal and cold. Harry had lingered for a moment, perhaps hoping for some sign of reconciliation. But Charles had been too hurt, too overwhelmed to find the right words. The silence that stretched between them had said everything that needed to be said. Now, standing in his study, with Harry's letter in his hands, Charles felt the full weight of that silence. The letter was an apology of sorts, but also a goodbye. Harry was returning to California, unsure when he might return to England again. The words spoke of love and regret, but also of a resignation that broke Charles's heart. As the afternoon sun began to filter through the London clouds, Charles made his way to his private apartments to pack for Sandringham. The palace staff moved quietly around him, sensing his mood and giving him the space he needed. They had seen the royal family weather many storms over the years, but this felt different, more personal, and potentially more damaging. The drive to Sandringham usually brought Charles peace, the familiar countryside rolling past his windows like a beloved painting coming to life. But today, the journey felt like an escape rather than a retreat. He was running from the weight of his failures as a father, from the impossible choices that kingship demanded, from the growing realization that he might have lost one of his sons forever. Sandringham House sat among its ancient trees like a sanctuary from the modern world. Charles had always loved the estate's relative simplicity compared to the grandeur of Buckingham Palace or Windsor Castle. Here, he could walk in his gardens, tend to his plants, and pretend for a moment that he was just a man dealing with family troubles, not a king whose personal life was scrutinized by the entire world. As his car pulled up to the main entrance, Charles saw that the staff had prepared the house for an extended stay. They knew him well enough to understand that this wasn't a brief weekend retreat, but something more significant. The king was removing himself from London, from the seat of his power, in search of something that seemed increasingly elusive: peace. That evening, as Charles sat in his favorite armchair by the fire, he found himself looking through old photograph albums. Pictures of Harry as a boy, laughing and carefree, filled the pages. There he was, learning to ride, celebrating his first successful fishing trip, standing proudly in his school uniform. Each image was a reminder of the closeness they had once shared and the distance that now lay between them. The phone rang several times throughout the evening. Edward calling with updates from London, William checking on his father's well-being, various officials needing decisions on matters of state. Charles answered when necessary but kept the conversations brief. He had come here to think, to try to find a way forward that didn't feel like a betrayal of either his role as king or his love for his son. As the night deepened and the Norfolk countryside settled into quiet darkness, Charles found himself writing his own letter. Not an official document or a carefully crafted royal statement, but something more personal. The words came slowly, each one weighed and considered, as he tried to express feelings that years of royal training had taught him to keep hidden. He wrote about his love for Harry, about the pride he had always felt in his son's compassion and determination to make the world a better place. He acknowledged the mistakes he had made, the times when the demands of duty had prevented him from being the father he wanted to be. He expressed his hope that somehow, someday, they might find a way back to each other. But he also wrote about the crown, about the responsibility he bore not just to his family, but to the entire nation. He tried to explain the impossible position of being both a father who wanted his children's happiness and a king who had sworn to serve something larger than himself. As dawn broke over Sandringham, Charles sealed the letter and set it aside. Whether he would ever send it remained to be seen. For now, it was enough that he had found the words to express what was in his heart, even if those words might never reach the person who needed to hear them most. The king had left London, but he had brought his heartbreak with him. The question now was whether the peace of Sandringham could help him find a way to heal the deepest wound of his reign, the growing chasm between a father and his son, between duty and love, between the crown and the heart that wore it. The second day at Sandringham dawned grey and overcast, matching the king's sombre mood as he walked through the estate's famous gardens. Charles had always found solace in these grounds, where he could lose himself in the simple act of tending to the earth. But even the familiar rhythm of gardening couldn't quiet the storm in his mind. The media had begun to notice his absence from London. Headlines were already speculating about the king's sudden departure from his official duties, with royal correspondents working their sources to understand what had driven the monarch to retreat to Norfolk. Charles could imagine the phone calls buzzing between newspaper offices and television studios, the careful dance of royal reporting that tried to balance respect for the monarchy with the public's insatiable appetite for royal drama. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic Ocean, Harry was dealing with his own media storm. The paparazzi had camped outside his Montecito home, hoping to catch a glimpse of the Duke, who had reportedly had a final falling out with his father. Neighbors in the exclusive California community had grown accustomed to the occasional media presence around the Sussex residence, but this felt different, more intense and sustained. Meghan watched from their kitchen window as photographers adjusted their long lenses, trying to capture anything that might tell the story of her husband's emotional state. She had been through her own battles with the British press, experiences that had left deep scars, and a determination to protect her family from further harm. Seeing Harry struggle with the aftermath of his London visit brought back painful memories of their decision to leave royal life behind. "They're not going to leave us alone, are they?" she asked quietly as Harry joined her at the window, their two children playing obliviously in the next room. Harry's jaw tightened as he looked out at the assembled media circus. "Not until they get their story," he replied, his voice carrying the weariness of someone who had spent his entire life being hunted by cameras. "They think if they wait long enough, they'll catch us in some moment of weakness." The irony wasn't lost on either of them that Harry's attempt to find peace with his family had only resulted in more scrutiny and speculation. Every move they made now would be analyzed for signs of the rift with his father. Every public appearance dissected for clues about the state of the royal relationship. Back in England, William found himself in an equally difficult position. As heir to the throne, he couldn't simply disappear to a country estate when family drama erupted. His calendar remained packed with official engagements, each one now carrying the additional weight of representing the royal family's stability in the absence of both his father and brother. Catherine, ever the steady presence by his side, watched her husband struggle with the competing demands of his public role and his private pain. She had seen how much the deteriorating relationship with Harry affected William, though he rarely spoke of it directly. The brothers who had once been inseparable had grown into men who seemed to inhabit completely different worlds. "You need to talk to him," Catherine said one evening as they sat in their Kensington Palace apartment, their children finally asleep after another day of carefully managed public appearances. William looked up from the briefing papers he had been pretending to read. "Who, Harry?" "Your father," Catherine replied gently. "He's isolating himself at Sandringham, and you're carrying the entire weight of the monarchy on your shoulders. This situation isn't sustainable." William set down his papers and rubbed his tired eyes. The strain of the past few weeks had been enormous, but he had been trained from birth to shoulder such burdens without complaint. What am I supposed to say to him? That I think he made the right choice in distancing himself from Harry? That I think he was wrong? Either way, I'm taking sides in a fight that's tearing our family apart. Catherine moved closer to her husband, understanding the impossible position he found himself in. As the future king, William had to think about the long-term stability of the monarchy, but as a son and brother, he was watching his family disintegrate before his eyes. The next morning brought news that would complicate the situation even further. A close friend of Harry's had given an interview to an American television network, speaking candidly about the Duke's state of mind and his deep disappointment with his family's response to his attempts at reconciliation. While the friend claimed to be speaking out of concern for Harry's well-being, the interview contained details about the private family meeting that had never been intended for public consumption. Edward Pemberton called King Charles at Sandringham with the news, his voice careful and measured as he summarized the friend's comments. The interview painted a picture of a young man who felt abandoned by his family, particularly his father, and who was questioning whether he would ever be able to have a meaningful relationship with them again. Charles listened in silence as Edward read through the key quotes, each one feeling like another small betrayal. He had hoped that their private conversation would remain exactly that. Private. The idea that details of their family's pain were being shared with the world felt like a violation of everything he held sacred about family loyalty. As Harry responded to this interview, Charles asked, his voice carefully controlled. "Not officially, Your Majesty," Edward replied, "but his representatives have issued a statement saying that while the Duke appreciates his friend's support, he did not authorize or request any public comments about private family matters." It was a careful statement, diplomatic in its wording, but Charles found little comfort in it. The damage was already done, and he knew that more interviews, more speculation, and more invasive coverage would follow. The royal family's private pain was becoming a very public spectacle, exactly what he had hoped to avoid. That afternoon, Charles received a visitor he hadn't expected. Princess Anne, his sister and one of the hardest-working members of the royal family, arrived at Sandringham unannounced. Anne had always been known for her direct manner and her no-nonsense approach to royal duties, but she also had a deep understanding of the unique pressures that came with their family's position. She found Charles in his study, staring out at the gardens with an expression she hadn't seen since their mother's death. Anne had weathered her own share of family difficulties over the years, including a very public divorce and various media scandals, but she had always managed to maintain her commitment to royal duties while protecting her personal life. "You can't hide here forever," Anne said without preamble, settling into the chair across from her brother's desk. Charles turned to face her, grateful for her presence even if he wasn't ready for the conversation she was clearly determined to have. "I'm not hiding, Anne. I'm thinking. The country needs to see their king," Anne continued, her voice firm but not unkind. "Every day you spend here gives the media more ammunition to speculate about the state of the monarchy. And frankly, it's not fair to William to leave him carrying the full burden of public duties while you retreat to Norfolk." Charles knew she was right, but the thought of returning to London, of facing the endless questions and carefully worded statements about his relationship with Harry, felt overwhelming. "How do I face the public when I can't even figure out how to be a father to my own son?" Anne's expression softened slightly. She had watched Charles struggle with the competing demands of parenthood and royal duty for decades, always trying to be both the father he wanted to be and the future king the nation needed. "You be the king you were born to be," she said simply, "and trust that being a good king and being a good father aren't mutually exclusive, even when it feels like they are." The conversation continued well into the evening, with Anne sharing her own perspective on the balance between public duty and private pain. She had learned over the years that the royal family's strength came not from perfection, but from their ability to continue serving despite personal challenges. "Harry chose his path," Anne said as they sat by the fire after dinner. "You can regret that choice. You can hope he changes his mind, but you can't sacrifice your duty to the crown in pursuit of a reconciliation that he may not even want." Her words were harsh, but not without compassion. Anne had always understood that royal life required difficult choices, that duty sometimes demanded sacrifices that ordinary families didn't have to make. She had made such sacrifices herself, and she had watched their mother make them with grace and dignity throughout her long reign. That night, Charles found himself reading through old letters from his mother, searching for guidance in her carefully preserved words. Queen Elizabeth II had faced her own family crises during her reign. From her sister Margaret's troubled love life to the divorces and scandals that had marked the 1990s as the royal family's annus horribilis. Through it all, she had maintained her commitment to her role while somehow managing to hold her family together. One letter, written shortly after Harry's birth, spoke of the joy she found in watching Charles with his new son. "You have such a natural way with children," she had written. "I can see how much love you have for both your boys, and I know that love will guide you through whatever challenges lie ahead." Reading those words now, Charles felt the full weight of his mother's faith in him and his own sense of falling short of her expectations. She had believed that love would be enough to navigate the challenges of royal parenthood, but the reality had proven more complicated than either of them could have imagined. The next morning brought more unwelcome news. A biography about Harry was being fast-tracked for publication, with the author claiming to have unprecedented access to the Duke's inner circle and previously unknown details about his relationship with the royal family. Publishing houses were in a bidding war for the rights, and early excerpts were already being leaked to generate publicity. The prospect of yet another tell-all book about his family filled Charles with a deep weariness. Each revelation, each claim and counterclaim, seemed to drive them further apart rather than bringing any hope of reconciliation. The public appetite for royal drama appeared insatiable, and his family's pain was becoming entertainment for millions of people around the world. Edward called with updates throughout the day as more details about the book emerged. The publisher was promising explosive revelations about life inside the royal family and Harry's final break with his father and brother. Whether or not the claims were accurate, the very existence of such a book would overshadow any attempts at private reconciliation. As the week at Sandringham drew to a close, Charles found himself facing a stark choice. He could continue to retreat from public life, hoping that time and distance might somehow heal the wounds between him and Harry, or he could return to London and face the reality that his role as king might require him to accept the loss of his relationship with his younger son. The decision, when it came, felt both inevitable and heartbreaking. Charles had spent his entire life preparing to be king, understanding that the crown demanded sacrifices that ordinary fathers never had to make. Perhaps this was simply another such sacrifice, the price of serving something larger than himself. He began to pack his belongings for the return to London, each item placed carefully in his cases representing another step back toward the duties he had temporarily abandoned. The letter he had written to Harry remained on his desk, unread by anyone but himself, a testament to feelings that might never be expressed outside the privacy of his own heart. As his car prepared to leave Sandringham, Charles took one last look at the gardens that had provided him such comfort over the years. The peace he had sought here remained elusive. But, perhaps, that had been naive. Some wounds were too deep for simple retreat and reflection to heal. Sometimes, a king had to accept that duty, and love could not be reconciled, no matter how much his heart might break in the process. The return journey to London felt like a funeral procession to King Charles, the familiar countryside passing by his window in a blur of grey morning light. Each mile brought him closer to a reality he had hoped to escape, a world where his private pain would once again become public property, and where every gesture would be scrutinized for signs of the royal family's internal struggles. Edward Pemberton had arranged for the king's return to be as low-key as possible, but Charles knew that nothing involving the monarchy ever stayed truly private for long. By the time his car pulled through the gates of Buckingham Palace, several photographers had already gathered, their telephoto lenses trained on the windows of the royal vehicle, hoping to capture some glimpse of the monarch's emotional state. Inside the palace, the atmosphere was tense with unspoken questions. Staff members who had served the royal family for decades moved with careful efficiency, their usual warmth tempered by uncertainty about what the king's retreat to Sandringham had meant and what his return might bring. The very walls seemed to hold their breath, waiting for some sign of how the royal household would navigate the crisis that had driven their sovereign away from his duties. William arrived within an hour of his father's return, his face carefully composed, but his eyes betraying the strain of the past week. He had shouldered the public duties admirably, attending engagements and meetings with his characteristic grace, but the weight of representing the monarchy alone had clearly taken its toll. The heir to the throne looked older than his years, burdened by responsibilities he had never expected to carry so early in his father's reign. "How are you feeling?" William asked as they met in Charles's private study, the same room where the crisis had begun just a week earlier. The question was simple, but both men understood its deeper meaning. How does a king feel when forced to choose between his crown and his child? "Like I've aged a decade in 7 days," Charles replied honestly, settling into his chair with the careful movements of a man carrying invisible wounds. "And you? I know this week has been difficult for you as well." William remained standing, his hands clasped behind his back in a gesture that reminded Charles painfully of their military training, the discipline that had shaped both their lives in ways that sometimes felt more like a burden than a blessing. The engagements went well. The people understand that you needed time away, though the media speculation has been relentless? Charles finished, and William nodded grimly. They talked for over an hour, father and son trying to navigate the complex terrain of their shared responsibilities, while avoiding the emotional landmine that Harry's absence represented. Neither wanted to say the words that hung between them like a sword. That perhaps the youngest member of their family was lost to them forever. That the institution they served had demanded a sacrifice too painful to acknowledge directly. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, Harry was facing his own impossible choices. The friend who had given the unauthorized interview had been quietly but firmly asked to step back from his inner circle, but the damage was done. More former friends and acquaintances were now emerging, encouraged by the media attention and the prospect of lucrative book deals or television appearances. Meghan found her husband in their garden, staring out at the Pacific Ocean that stretched endlessly toward the horizon. Even in the California sunshine, Harry seemed diminished, carrying a sadness that no amount of distance from his former life seemed able to heal. The little boy who had once charmed the world with his mischievous smile and obvious love for his father had grown into a man who felt orphaned by the very family that had given him life. "Maybe we should make a statement," Meghan suggested carefully, joining him on the bench they had installed to watch the sunset each evening. "Something to stop all this speculation about what happened in London." Harry shook his head slowly, his expression distant. "What would we say? That I tried to reach out to my father and it went badly? That my brother and I can't be in the same room without fighting? That the family I loved and served for 38 years has made it clear that I'm not welcome anymore?" The pain in his voice was evident, and Meghan felt her own heart break for the man who had given up everything he had known to build a life with her. She had never wanted to be the cause of his estrangement from his family, but the circumstances of their departure from royal life had made such estrangement almost inevitable. "You know it's more complicated than that," she said gently, taking his hand in hers. "Your father loves you. This whole situation is just impossible," Harry finished. "I know he loves me, but he loves the crown more. He always has. That's not his fault, really. He was trained from birth to put the monarchy before everything else, including his own children. But knowing that doesn't make it hurt any less." The conversation was interrupted by a call from their security team. Another photographer had been spotted on the beach below their home, using powerful lenses to try to capture images of the family's private moments. The invasion of their privacy was relentless, driven by the global appetite for any details about the royal rift that had captivated newspapers and television networks around the world. Back in London, Charles was discovering that his week-long absence had created its own set of problems. Several important decisions had been delayed pending his return, and foreign dignitaries who had expected meetings with the king were having to be diplomatically rescheduled. The smooth operation of the monarchy, which depended on the sovereign's consistent presence and engagement, had been disrupted in ways that would take time to repair. More concerning was the political dimension of his absence. The Prime Minister's office had been carefully neutral in their public statements, but privately, there were concerns about the stability of the monarchy during the time when the country faced significant economic and social challenges. The royal family was supposed to provide continuity and reassurance, not become another source of uncertainty and division. That evening, Charles received an unexpected visitor. Archbishop of Canterbury, Justin Welby, requested an urgent audience with the king. As the spiritual head of the Church of England, the Archbishop had a unique relationship with the monarchy, serving as both counsellor and conscience to the sovereign in times of personal and institutional crisis. "Your Majesty," the Archbishop began carefully as they met in Charles's private reception room. "I hope you don't mind my coming without an appointment, but I felt it was important that we speak." Charles appreciated the Archbishop's directness. Throughout his life, he had found value in conversations with spiritual leaders who could speak to him not just as a king, but as a man struggling with impossible choices. "I assume this is about Harry." "Partly," Archbishop Welby replied, settling into his chair with the comfortable manner of someone accustomed to difficult conversations. "But it's also about you, about your role, and about how we help heal not just your family, but the institution you serve." The conversation that followed was unlike any Charles had experienced since becoming king. The Archbishop spoke candidly about the challenges of leadership, about the way public figures could become symbols that overshadowed their humanity, and about the particular burden of trying to be both a father and a king in an age when privacy was increasingly impossible. "The prodigal son is one of the most powerful stories in Christian tradition," the Archbishop said at one point. "But we often forget that it's as much about the father's grief and hope as it is about the son's journey away and potentially back home. Charles found unexpected comfort in the religious framework for understanding his situation. The idea that his role was not just to be disappointed in Harry's choices, but to remain open to the possibility of reconciliation, even when that hope seemed naive, gave him a different perspective on the crisis.
But what if he never comes home? Charles asked, voicing the fear that had haunted him since Harry's departure from royal life.
What if my choice to put duty first means I lose him forever? The Archbishop was quiet for a long moment before responding. Then you will have served your calling as king, even at enormous personal cost. But that doesn't mean the door has to be permanently closed, or that love has to end simply because circumstances make it difficult to express. Their conversation continued late into the evening, touching on themes of forgiveness, sacrifice, and the complex relationship between public service and private happiness. Charles found himself thinking about his mother's example, how she had managed to maintain relationships with family members even when their choices had created difficulties for the monarchy. The next morning brought news that would test Charles's newly found perspective. Harry had agreed to participate in a major television interview with an American network, scheduled to air in 2 weeks' time. The interview was being promoted as his first comprehensive discussion of his relationship with the royal family since leaving England, and advance publicity suggested he would address the recent family meeting directly. Edward Pemberton delivered the news with characteristic diplomatic care, but Charles could see the concern in his private secretary's eyes. Another major television interview by Harry had the potential to damage the monarchy's reputation and deepen the rift between father and son. The wounds from previous interviews were still fresh, and the prospect of new revelations felt almost unbearable. "Has he given any indication of what he plans to discuss?" Charles asked, though he suspected the answer would offer little comfort. "The network is promising unprecedented candor about his decision to distance himself from the royal family," Edward replied carefully. "They're also suggesting he will address his future relationship with the monarchy directly." Charles closed his eyes, feeling the weight of his crown more heavily than ever. Each interview, each book, each public statement seemed to drive them further apart rather than offering any hope of healing. The very publicity that might help Harry establish his new identity in America was simultaneously making any private reconciliation with his family increasingly difficult. That afternoon, Charles made a decision that surprised even himself. He picked up his private phone and dialed Harry's number in California, unsure if his son would even answer, but knowing he had to try. The call went straight to voicemail, Harry's familiar voice asking callers to leave a message, the same voice that had once called him Papa, with such obvious love and trust. Charles listened to the entire message before hanging up without leaving one of his own. What could he say? How could he summarize the complex emotions of the past week, the grief and disappointment and lingering hope that somehow they might find their way back to each other? Some conversations required more than a voicemail could contain, and some wounds needed more than words to heal. As evening fell over London, Charles stood once again at the windows of his study, looking out at the city he had sworn to serve. The lights of millions of homes twinkled in the distance, each representing families with their own struggles and challenges, their own moments of love, and loss and forgiveness. Perhaps his role was not to solve the crisis with Harry, but to demonstrate that service to something larger than oneself could continue even in the face of personal heartbreak. Perhaps being king meant accepting that some sacrifices were so painful they left permanent scars, but that duty required making them nonetheless. The letter he had written to Harry at Sandringham still sat unopened in his desk drawer, its words unread by anyone but himself. Whether he would ever find the courage to send it remained to be seen. But for now, it represented the hope that somewhere beneath the crown and the protocol and the endless public scrutiny, a father's love for his son endured, waiting for the right moment to bridge the distance between duty and devotion. 2 weeks after King Charles's return from Sandringham, the royal household was bracing for impact. Harry's television interview was scheduled to air that evening, and despite all attempts to maintain normal operations, tension filled every corner of Buckingham Palace like an oppressive fog. Staff members went about their duties with unusual quiet, while senior advisors huddled in emergency meetings to prepare for whatever revelations the interview might contain. Charles had declined to watch any advance excerpts, though he knew his communications team was monitoring every snippet released by the American network. The promotional campaign had been relentless, with carefully chosen quotes and emotional moments designed to maximize viewership. "I had to choose between my family and my sanity." One preview clip showed Harry saying, his voice thick with emotion, "That shouldn't have been a choice I had to make." William had also refused to watch the previews. but Catherine had kept him informed of the growing media storm. The heir to the throne was scheduled to attend a charity gala that evening, a long-planned engagement that would now serve as an unintentional test of the royal family's ability to maintain dignity under pressure. Every photograph, every interaction would be analysed for signs of how the family was handling Harry's latest public appearance. Meanwhile, in Montecito, Harry was experiencing his own crisis of confidence. The interview had been filmed 3 days earlier, and in the time since, he had found himself second-guessing many of his responses. Speaking publicly about private family matters never felt natural to him, but the alternative seemed to be allowing others to tell his story for him, often in ways that bore little resemblance to his actual experience. Meghan had been supportive, but clearly worried about the potential consequences of the interview. She had seen how previous public statements had deepened rather than resolved family conflicts, and she feared that this latest appearance might make reconciliation even more difficult. Their children were too young to understand the implications, but she knew they would eventually grow up in a world shaped by these very public family disputes. "Are you sure about this?" she had asked him again that morning as they watched their children play in the garden, oblivious to the media storm that was about to engulf their parents once again. Harry had nodded, though his confidence seemed forced. "If I don't tell my story, someone else will tell it for me, and their version won't be kind to anyone, least of all my father." The interview, when it finally aired, exceeded even the most dramatic expectations. Harry spoke with painful honesty about feeling abandoned by his family, about the weight of royal expectations, and about his desperate attempts to maintain relationships that seemed doomed by the very institution they all served. His voice broke as he described the moment he realized that his father might choose the crown over their relationship. "I've always known that the monarchy came first for my father," Harry said, looking directly into the camera. "That was how he was raised, how he was trained. But I suppose I hoped that when it came down to it, love might be stronger than duty. I was naive to think that." The interviewer pressed him on his decision to speak publicly about such private matters, and Harry's response was perhaps the most devastating moment of the entire program. "I tried private conversations. I tried family meetings. I tried everything I could think of to find some way to remain part of my family while also protecting my own family. But every attempt was met with more protocol, more concerns about how things would look publicly, more reminders that the institution was bigger than any individual relationship." Across the ocean, Charles watched the interview alone in his private quarters, having finally decided he needed to hear his son's words directly rather than through the filter of advisors and press summaries. Each accusation, each expression of pain and disappointment, hit him like a physical blow. This was his child, the little boy he had loved and protected and worried about, now telling the world that his father had failed him in the most fundamental way possible. The most painful moment came when Harry spoke about their recent meeting in London, the conversation that had driven Charles to retreat to Sandringham. "I went into that room hoping for a father," Harry said, his voice barely above a whisper. "But I found a king instead, and I realized in that moment that maybe I'd been looking for something that doesn't exist anymore, if it ever did." Charles paused the recording, unable to continue watching for several minutes. The accusation was devastating not because it was unfair, but because it contained more truth than he was comfortable acknowledging. He had spent decades learning to compartmentalize his roles, to separate his personal feelings from his public duties, but perhaps in doing so, he had lost something essential about who he was as a father. When he resumed watching, Harry was discussing his hopes for the future, his determination to break what he called the cycle of pain that had characterized his family for generations. "I want my children to know their grandfather," Harry said, tears visible in his eyes. "But I also want them to know that love doesn't have conditions, that family doesn't come second to anything else, that they will always be more important than any institution or tradition." The interview concluded with Harry expressing a bittersweet hope for eventual reconciliation, while acknowledging that such healing would require changes he wasn't sure the royal family was capable of making. "I will always love my father," he said in his final statement. "But love alone isn't enough to bridge the distance between us. That would require him to be willing to put our relationship before his crown, and I'm not sure that's something he can do." The immediate aftermath of the broadcast was explosive. Social media erupted with reactions ranging from sympathy for Harry's emotional pain to criticism of his decision to air such private grievances publicly. News networks around the world replayed the most dramatic moments, while royal correspondents provided endless analysis of what the interview might mean for the future of the monarchy. At the charity gala, William maintained his composure admirably, but those who knew him well could see the strain in his carefully controlled expressions. When asked by reporters about his brother's interview, he simply said, I wish Harry well and hope he finds the peace he's looking for. The statement was diplomatic but notably lacking in any expression of hope for reconciliation. Charles spent a sleepless night walking through the palace corridors, past portraits of his ancestors who had faced their own family crises and survived them. He thought about his mother's ability to weather scandals and maintain the monarchy's stability, about his great-great-grandmother Victoria's long reign despite personal tragedies, about the resilience that had characterized the House of Windsor through decades of change. But this felt different, more personal and potentially more damaging than previous crises. This was not about divorce or scandal or even political controversy. This was about the fundamental question of whether the monarchy could coexist with genuine family relationships, whether duty and love could ever be truly reconciled. The next morning brought a flood of requests for official responses to Harry's interview. Buckingham Palace's communications team had prepared several potential statements, ranging from brief acknowledgements to more detailed rebuttals of specific claims. But Charles found himself reluctant to engage in a public back and forth with his own son, sensing that such exchanges would only deepen their estrangement. Instead, he chose a path that surprised many of his advisors. Rather than issuing a formal statement, Charles decided to make an unannounced visit to one of his favorite charities, a youth centre in a disadvantaged area of London, where he had been a patron for nearly 2 decades. The visit had no official purpose beyond his desire to reconnect with the kind of work that had always given his life meaning. The young people at the centre had no interest in royal protocol or family drama. They were focused on their own challenges and aspirations, and Charles found their directness refreshing after weeks of diplomatic conversations and carefully worded statements. One teenager, apparently unaware of the recent media storm, asked him simply, "Do you like being king?" The question caught Charles off guard with its simple honesty. After a moment's pause, he replied, "It's not about liking it. It's about serving something bigger than yourself, even when that service requires sacrifices you never expected to make." The young man nodded thoughtfully, perhaps understanding more than Charles had given him credit for. "My dad left when I was little," he said, "but the workers here, they stepped up. Sometimes family isn't just about blood, you know. Sometimes it's about who shows up when you need them." The conversation stayed with Charles throughout the day, offering a perspective on family and duty that his royal upbringing had never provided. Perhaps the tragedy was not that he had chosen duty over family, but that he had been taught to see those two things as incompatible when they might actually be different expressions of the same fundamental commitment to something larger than oneself. That evening, Charles finally took out the letter he had written to Harry at Sandringham. Reading it again, he was struck by how much of his own pain and regret it contained, but also how little it acknowledged Harry's perspective or the validity of his grievances. It was the letter of a father who loved his son but couldn't understand why that love wasn't enough to overcome their differences. He began writing a new letter, one that sought to bridge the gap between understanding Harry's position and explaining his own impossible choices. It was harder to write, requiring him to acknowledge his own failures while also explaining the constraints that had shaped his decisions. But, for the first time since the crisis began, Charles felt like he might be finding words that could cross the divide between father and son, between king and child. Meanwhile, in California, Harry was dealing with the aftermath of his own choices. The interview had generated enormous sympathy and support, but also criticism from those who felt he had violated family privacy. More painfully, it had also generated silence from the family members he most hoped to reach. No calls, no messages, no acknowledgement that his words had been heard or understood. Meghan found him in his study, staring at his phone as if willing it to ring with news from London. "Maybe this is how it has to be," she said gently, settling beside him. "Maybe some relationships can't survive the weight of everything that's happened." Harry shook his head, though his convictions seemed fragile. "He's my father. Somewhere, underneath the crown, and the protocol, and all the rest of it, he's still my dad. That has to count for something." But as the days passed without any response from London, Harry began to wonder if he had been wrong about that fundamental connection. Perhaps the transformation from father to king was so complete that nothing of the original relationship remained. Perhaps his interview had been not an attempt at communication, but a final farewell to a relationship that had already ended. The silence stretched between London and California like an ocean that grew wider with each passing day. Two men who had once shared the closest of bonds now seemed to exist in completely different worlds, each nursing wounds that the other couldn't heal, each hoping for reconciliation while simultaneously making choices that made such healing increasingly unlikely. The crown had claimed another sacrifice, and both father and son were left to wonder whether the cost had been worth paying. or if they had simply become the latest casualties in a system that demanded everything and forgave nothing. 3 months had passed since Harry's television interview, and the royal family had settled into a new reality defined by absence rather than presence. The empty chair at family gatherings had become a permanent reminder of the price of uncompromising positions, while the media's appetite for updates on the rift seemed only to grow stronger with each passing week. King Charles had thrown himself into his royal duties with renewed intensity, as if the weight of additional engagements might somehow balance the lightness he felt from his son's absence. His calendar was packed from morning until night, filled with state visits, charity events, and constitutional duties that left little time for private reflection or personal grief. His staff noticed that he worked longer hours than ever before, often staying late into the evening to review briefings and prepare for upcoming engagements. The strategy was partly successful. Public approval ratings for the monarchy had stabilized after the initial shock of Harry's revelations, and Charles's visible commitment to his role had earned praise from political leaders and constitutional experts. But those closest to him could see the toll that the estrangement was taking. The king seemed to have aged years in just months, his shoulders carrying a weight that went beyond the ceremonial burden of the crown. William had also adapted to the new reality, stepping up to take on additional responsibilities as his father's schedule intensified. The Prince of Wales had developed a careful public persona that acknowledged his brother's absence without dwelling on it. Speaking of family challenges, when pressed by reporters, but always redirecting conversations toward his charitable work and royal duties. Catherine watched her husband navigate this impossible balance with growing concern. She could see how much the loss of his relationship with Harry affected William, despite his careful public composure. The brothers who had once shared everything now existed in parallel universes, each following the public statements and appearances of the other through news reports rather than personal communication. "You miss him," Catherine said one evening, as they watched their children play in Kensington Palace's private gardens. It wasn't a question, but an observation, spoken with the gentle directness that had always characterized their relationship. William's jaw tightened slightly, the only sign of the emotion he worked so hard to control. "I miss who we used to be," he replied carefully. "I miss being brothers instead of being symbols of different approaches to royal life, but I also know that some choices can't be undone." The conversation reflected a broader truth about the royal family's situation. The public had begun to see the rift not just as a personal tragedy, but as a representation of competing visions for the monarchy's future. Harry had become a symbol of modernization and emotional authenticity, while William represented tradition and institutional loyalty. The media narrative had simplified a complex family relationship into a broader cultural debate about duty versus personal happiness. In California, Harry was also struggling with this symbolic burden. His interview had been intended as a personal statement about his own experiences, but it had been received as a manifesto about the monarchy's inability to adapt to modern expectations. Supporters praised his courage in speaking truth to power, while critics accused him of betraying his family and his country for personal gain and American celebrity status. The weight of these interpretations was becoming increasingly difficult to bear. Harry had wanted to explain his own choices and experiences, but instead he found himself cast as a representative of everyone who had ever felt constrained by tradition or disappointed by family expectations. The personal had become political in ways he had never intended or desired. Meghan could see how the ongoing situation was affecting her husband's mental health. The man who had once been energized by his royal work and passionate about serving others now seemed diminished by the constant scrutiny of his motivations and the endless speculation about his relationship with his family. Their new life in America had brought them freedom from many royal constraints, but it had also brought a different kind of pressure and a persistent sense of incompleteness. "Maybe it's time to stop hoping for something that isn't going to happen," she suggested one evening, as they sat on their terrace, watching the Pacific sunset paint the sky in brilliant colors. "Maybe we need to accept that this is how things are going to be and focus on building the life we want here." Harry understood the wisdom in her words, but something in him still rebelled against the finality they implied. "He's my father," he said, echoing words he had spoken many times over the past months. "That has to mean something, even if everything else has changed." But as more time passed without any contact from London, Harry began to wonder if he was clinging to a relationship that existed more in memory than in current reality. The father he remembered from his childhood seemed increasingly distant from the king, who had made no effort to reach out after the interview, no attempt to bridge the growing divide between them. The breaking point came in the form of a letter that arrived at Harry's California home on a crisp autumn morning. The envelope bore the royal seal, and for a moment Harry's heart leaped with hope that perhaps his father had finally decided to reach out. But when he opened it, he found not a personal message but an official communication from the palace's legal department, informing him of changes to his security arrangements and formal protocols regarding his status as a non-working member of the royal family. The letter was professionally written and legally precise, but it felt to Harry like the final severing of any remaining connection to his former life. Every sentence seemed designed to emphasize his outsider status, his separation from the institution that had once defined his identity. There was no personal note from his father, no acknowledgement that these changes might be difficult for him to accept. Harry called the palace immediately, hoping to speak with his father directly, but was politely redirected to the appropriate department heads, who could discuss the technical aspects of the new arrangements. The message was clear. Their relationship had been reduced to official protocols and legal documents, with no room for the personal conversation he desperately wanted to have. That same week, Charles was dealing with his own moment of reckoning. While reviewing his schedule for the upcoming Christmas season, he realized that for the first time in decades, Harry would not be joining the family at Sandringham for their traditional holiday gathering. The absence that had become routine throughout the year would be particularly sharp during a season defined by family traditions and shared memories. Edward Pemberton had discreetly inquired about whether any invitation should be extended to California, but Charles had quietly declined to pursue it. The wounds from Harry's interview were still fresh, and the king's advisors had made it clear that any public reconciliation attempt that failed would only generate more negative publicity for the monarchy. But as Charles walked through the Sandringham estate where he and Harry had shared so many happy memories, the weight of that decision pressed heavily on his heart. He remembered Christmas mornings when Harry was small, the excitement and laughter that had filled these same rooms, the sense of family that had made even the formal aspects of royal life feel warm and meaningful. Princess Anne found him in the library that had always been his retreat, staring at family photographs that seemed to mock the current reality of their fractured relationships. She had been watching her brother struggle with the situation for months, and her typical directness had given way to a gentler approach as she recognized the depth of his pain. "You could still reach out to him," she said simply, settling into the chair beside his desk. "It doesn't have to be a public gesture. It doesn't have to involve the palace or the press or anyone else. It could just be a father calling his son." Charles looked up from the photograph he had been holding, a picture of Harry as a young boy, grinning widely as he helped his father in the Sandringham gardens. "What would I say? That I'm sorry he feels hurt, but I'm not sorry for the choices I've made? That I love him, but I can't give him what he wants? That I understand his position, but I can't abandon mine?" Anne was quiet for a long moment, understanding that these were not rhetorical questions, but genuine expressions of her brother's impossible position. "Maybe you could say that you miss him," she suggested finally. Maybe that would be enough to start with. The conversation stayed with Charles throughout the day, challenging his assumption that reaching out would only lead to more disappointment and public scrutiny. Perhaps Anne was right that some gestures could remain private, that fathers and sons could speak to each other without the world listening in and judging every word. That evening, Charles made a decision that surprised even himself. He picked up his personal phone and dialed Harry's number, not caring that it was early morning in California, or that months of silence had passed between them. The call went straight to voicemail again, but this time Charles didn't hang up. "Harry, it's your father," he began, his voice uncertain but determined. "I know we haven't spoken in a long time, and I know there's a great deal of hurt between us. I don't expect this call to fix anything, but I wanted you to know that I think about you every day. I wanted you to know that despite everything that's happened, despite all the things we can't seem to resolve, you are still my son, and I am still your father. That hasn't changed, even if everything else has." He paused, struggling to find words that could bridge the vast distance between them. "I may not be able to give you the father you want or need, but I hope someday we might find a way to accept the father and son we actually are. I love you, Harry. I always have, and I always will." Charles ended the call, feeling emotionally drained but somehow lighter than he had in months. He had no way of knowing whether Harry would listen to the message or how he might respond, but the act of reaching out had felt necessary regardless of the outcome. In California, Harry listened to the voicemail 3 times before calling Meghan into the room to hear it as well. His father's voice sounded older, more uncertain than he remembered, but also more genuine than it had in their recent interactions. The message contained no promises of change, no dramatic gestures of reconciliation, but it did contain something Harry had been longing to hear. an acknowledgement that their relationship still mattered, even in its damaged state. For the first time in months, Harry picked up his phone and dialed his father's number. The call went to voicemail, and Harry found himself leaving his own message, his voice thick with emotion, as he tried to express feelings that had been building for months. "Papa," he began, using the childhood name that felt both foreign and natural after so much time had passed. "Thank you for calling. I've been waiting to hear from you, hoping that maybe we could find some way to talk without all the protocol and press attention and everything else that makes it so hard to just be family." He paused, gathering courage for words that felt risky but necessary. "I know I've made choices you don't understand, and I know you've made choices that hurt me. Maybe we can't fix all of that, but maybe we can accept it and figure out how to love each other anyway. I'd like to try, if you would." The two voicemails, crossing an ocean and months of silence, represented something fragile but precious. Hope, not for a complete reconciliation or a return to the way things had been, but for the possibility that love might be stronger than disappointment, that family bonds might survive even the weight of crowns and the pressure of public scrutiny. Neither father nor son knew what would come next, whether their tentative reaching out would lead to healing or simply to new forms of heartbreak. But for the first time since the rift had deepened into a chasm, both men were willing to risk the vulnerability that genuine reconciliation would require. The royal divide remained, marked by an ocean and competing loyalties and fundamental disagreements about duty and family. But perhaps, in the space between those voicemails, there existed the possibility of a bridge that could span even the deepest wounds, built not on agreement or understanding, but on the simple, stubborn persistence of love itself.
Whether that bridge would prove strong enough to support the weight of their differences remained to be seen.
But in choosing to build it at all, both men had taken the first step toward reclaiming something that duty and disappointment had nearly destroyed. The bond between a father and his son, imperfect and strained but somehow still unbroken beneath all the public drama and private pain. The crown would continue to demand its sacrifices, and the distance between London and California would remain vast. But love, as both men were slowly learning, could exist even in the spaces between duty and desire, between what was expected and what was possible, between the king and the father, between the institution and the heart.